morning class. This is ECON 512, Introduction to International Trade class. Today is February 3rd, Thursday. The class will cover chapter 4 of the textbook. So today we will cover the first half of chapter 4, and next Tuesday we will cover the second half of chapter 4. The topics of the first half of chapter 4 include factor price equalization, two sources of comparative advantage, 3. Evidence on the Hexaolean Theorem, 4. Specific factors models, 5. The Hexaolean Theorem in detail. So let's watch these individual video clips.
Now let's consider the topic of factor price equalization. What's at stake here are the returns to labor and the returns to capital, and the question is to what extent trade tends to bring those returns closer together, across nations, that is. So, for instance, in this application, if the United States starts trading with China, what we would expect is that wages rise in China, initially the lower wage country, and in turn wages fall in the United States. That represents some degree of factor price equalization. There are more specific and more formal versions of factor price equalization theorems, and they tend to be put in what's called a Hexaolean setting. That is, we can postulate two countries, two goods, and two factors, and each of those two countries will have some comparative advantage based on whether it has more capital or more labor. For more on this, see our videos on the Hexaolean Theorem. In any case, the extreme result of true factor price equalization is a polar result based on some extreme assumptions. So imagine you have perfect competition, free trade, identical technologies around the globe, and no transportation costs. Well, if it were the case that wages were lower in China, why would you invest in the United States? Put all your investment in China, build the goods and services in China, and then ship them to the United States until the wages in the two countries would be exactly equal. In this setting, trade really is managing to equalize factor prices through a mechanism of arbitrage. The thing is, as a general result, factor price equalization is very far from true. In a lot of goods and services, the United States and China have free trade or nearly free trade, and still, wages in the United States are many times higher than wages in China. One reality which violates the assumptions of the theorem is simply the notion of different technologies. America has some more productive technologies than China, and America also has some very different institutions. Great Britain has different institutions than, say, Italy, and again, you do not see wages equalizing even though those two countries have nearly free trade. A weaker version of factor price equalization is the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, which states, namely, that a change in the price of a traded good results in a more than proportional change in the same direction in the price of the factor that is used in the production of that good more intensively. To make this approach more concrete, imagine that trade opens up between, say, the U.S. and China. The theorem is predicting wages rise in China, fall in the United States. Capital returns rise in the United States, fall in China. But here's the key part. The returns to the factors will change more in percentage terms than the goods prices will change. Let's consider the intuition here. Let's say that the opening of trade causes a price to fall, and that's a price for the labor-intensive good coming from China. It's the case in the theorem that in the U.S., the return to capital is rising, and the return to labor is falling. Because we've assumed perfect competition, basically prices of goods have to be equal to their costs of production. So if we have a price of something that is falling, And we already know that in the U.S. the return to capital is rising, while the return to labor has to be falling all the more than the change in the price of the good. And that is sometimes called the magnification effect. You might wonder, well, how true is that theorem? And actually, overall in the data, it doesn't appear to be very true at all. So, for instance, the prices of iPhones across different countries have converged much more than wages across different countries. Or try buying Big Macs around the world in different countries. The prices are somewhat different, but they're not that far apart. Wages seem across countries much further apart than, say, the prices of Big Macs. So the Stolp-Samuelson results, it's considered an interesting analytical proposition, a way of thinking about relationships, but in general it's not considered that good a description of the actual real world. For more on these topics, you can Google factor price equalization and Stolp-Samuelson theorem. In general, this is a highly mathematical literature, and the level of math goes beyond what we're offering in this course. If you'd like to see several pages of working through of one algebraic example, you can consult the Feenstra and Taylor book on the Stolp-Samuelson theorem. There's also a good technical piece by John Chipman on the relationship between factor price equalization and Stolp-Samuelson. And really, for a more concrete approach to some of these topics, I would recommend our videos on offshoring and also our video called Trade, Migration, and Investment as Substitutes.
Hi. In earlier lectures on comparative advantage, we assumed that different countries had different productivities in different industries. Today what we want to do is just briefly fill that in a little bit and explain why productivities might differ in different industries in different countries. Let's go. The most obvious differences are those associated with climate or geography or natural resources. And indeed, this is how Ricardo first phrased the comparative advantage model, in terms of wine and cloth, with Portugal being better at producing wine and England having a comparative advantage in producing cloth. So when we're thinking about agriculture or mining or tourism, then these differences in climate can create differences in comparative advantage. Bear in mind, however, don't forget, it is comparative advantage. So Florida may have an absolute advantage both in producing oranges and in producing tourism, but its comparative advantage may be in producing, let's say, tourism. So even if Florida is the best place in the world for growing oranges, we might see more tourism there and more oranges grown elsewhere if Florida has a comparative advantage in tourism. Okay, what else? Another advantage created by the fact that labor is not internationally mobile is that different countries have different proportions of capital to labor or low skill to high skill labor, different proportions of the factors of production. So some countries, for example, have a lot of low skill labor. They have a comparative advantage in producing goods which require a lot of low skill. Other countries have more high skill labor. They have a comparative advantage in producing, aircraft, for example, which requires a lot of high skill. This, by the way, is the Hexaolean model, and a lot has been written about this model. Increasing returns to scale in the division of labor is another source of comparative advantage. And this one is interesting because it's a source of comparative advantage which may be created by trade rather than existing naturally before trade. And the focus on models with increasing returns to scale came about when people realized that countries which are ex ante quite similar, they trade quite a bit. So the biggest trading partner for the United States is Canada, which looks a lot like the United States. Don't tell the Canadians that, but it's true. Developed countries in general trade most with other developed countries. Theory of comparative advantage says that, it's a little bit odd because you want to trade with countries that are different than you, not with countries that are the same as you. So how does increasing returns explain that the fact that countries which are quite similar trade a lot? Well, by specializing, countries can increase the productivity, They become ex post different. After they specialize, they become different, and then they can trade based upon those increases in productivity. So, for example, in the world, we don't need every single country to have its own automobile plant, to have its own set of automobile producers. It's better to specialize in one or two or half a dozen countries producing automobiles because you get economies of scale. It becomes cheaper to produce automobiles per unit the more automobiles are produced. So by specializing, one country produces automobiles, another country produces aircraft, another country produces computerized chips. By specializing, countries can take advantage of economies of scale. They then become more productive in one good or a set of goods, and then they trade for the other goods that they want. So it's still comparative advantage, but it's comparative advantage created afterwards in order to take advantage of increasing returns. And in these models, what you can show is that you get lower costs and greater variety. Paul Krugman won a Nobel Prize in part for his work on these models, and later I'll point you towards his Nobel Prize lecture. What else? When we think about increasing returns to scale, we typically think about, a big dam, or we think about a huge auto plant which is able to take advantage of robots the bigger it gets, or giant agricultural farms and so forth. But it's important to realize that increasing returns to scale can also refer to the division of knowledge. That is, as people specialize, they become more knowledgeable about an area, and that is what increases their productivity. So think about physicians. We don't simply have generic physicians. We have heart surgeons. We have brain surgeons. We have podiatrists, specialists in the feet. We have specialists in the ear, nose, and throat. We have cancer specialists, diabetes specialists. So by dividing knowledge among many different brains, we get a vast increase in productivity. So the examples I've given are more about interpersonal division of knowledge, increasing returns to scale and trade, but this also happens across countries as well. Different countries or different regions within a country specialize in different areas. Hollywood, for example, Silicon Valley. Dalton, Georgia is the world's leading producer of carpets because you have a lot of specialized knowledge in that region. That's what makes them productive. The specialization of knowledge, not so much that they have giant factories, but they have smart people who know a lot. Institutions can also generate comparative advantage. So, for example, some countries have more labor market flexibility than do other countries. Countries with a lot of flexibility, so where they can take workers from one area of the economy and move them quickly into another area of the economy, they tend to specialize more in high-value products, but for which there's a lot of variability, a lot of variability in demand, for example. Another example is finance. Some countries have better banking structures. If you're going to need a lot of finance, then you're going to want to be in a country like the United States where you can easily raise a lot of capital. That gives a big comparative advantage to the United States in production, which requires huge amounts of capital. Contract enforcement. In some countries, it's very difficult to enforce contracts, so they're going to specialize in production, which doesn't require a big division of labor, a big division of knowledge, which can be done all within one family or within one firm, smaller firm, or where you require less contracts. If you require a greater division of labor over more firms, over more parts of the country, over more people, you're going to want to be in a country which has better contract enforcement. So for all of these reasons, these are all sources of comparative advantage. So here are some further resources on Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, on factor proportions. Here's Paul Krugman's Nobel Prize lecture, which is quite accessible, and I recommend it. You'll also see it in our list of lectures. Okay, thanks very much.
Now let's take a look at what the evidence says about the Hexaolean Theorem. But of course, you should be watching this in conjunction with our video on the Hexaolean Theorem itself. We're going back to the key question of what explains trade. And here we're talking about the quantity, the direction, and also the composition of that trade. One possible nomination for an explanatory factor about trade is factor intensities, namely whether your country has a lot of capital or a lot of labor relative to other countries in the world. So just to recap the Hexaolean Theorem, or HOT for short, it's saying that capital-intensive countries, by global standards that is, should be exporting capital-intensive products. Similarly, labor-intensive countries, again by global standards, should be exporting labor-intensive products. You can think of these propositions as a way of making the theory of comparative advantage just a little more concrete. So, for instance, if your country has a lot of capital relative to global standards, you might expect that, all other things being equal, that country will be very good at exporting capital-intensive products. In any case, that's the hypothesis which the Hexaolean Theorem is directing our attention to. But of course, we run up against that very tough question, is this actually true? Now enter Vasily Leontief, who later won a Nobel Prize in economics. He published a very famous paper in 1953, and in that paper he calculated the labor output and capital output ratios for a variety of sectors in the American economy. He also calculated how much capital and how much labor are embodied in exports. And here's the problem. By global standards, as you might expect, the United States measured as capital intensive. Yet if you look at the content of American exports, in Leontief's paper he found that the U.S. exports on net labor-intensive goods, and it imports on net capital-intensive goods, and of course that's exactly the opposite of what the Hexaolean Theorem would lead you to believe. Actually, ever since Leontief's paper in the 1950s, the empirical status of Hexaolean has been somewhat in a state of crisis. And so this is a puzzle which researchers have been trying to solve for the last 60 years. Another important test, again with largely negative results, came in a famous paper by Bowen, Lemur, and Svaikauskas published in 1987. They developed what is called the sign test. To do the sign test, you start by looking at a country's factor endowment. For instance, you might decide that a particular country is capital intensive. You then want to ask about the exports of that country. Will the exports of that country also be capital intensive? In essence, you're testing to see if you can find the same sign. Yet for that simple test, using global data, actually the Hexaolean theorem fails at least 1/3 of the time. The authors also develop what is called the rank test. So let's say we look at a country which ranks, say, at number 3 when it comes to labor intensity of its factors. We would expect that same country, when you're looking at the factor content of its exports, to rank very high when it comes to labor intensity of exports. Yet in general, that is not the case. The rank order of factor intensity in a country does not very well predict the rank order of factor content in that country's exports. Instead, a country which ranks really high in terms of having a lot of labor will be exporting more capital in its goods than you might have otherwise tended to expect. Further empirical problems for the Hexaolean theorem came out of a 1995 paper by Treffler called The Case of the Missing Trade and Other Mysteries. The missing trade puzzle is this. Given that there are big differences in factor endowments across countries, we should in fact expect to see much more trade than what we actually observe. Furthermore, the trade we do see on net doesn't actually send much embodied capital to the labor-intensive countries or much embodied labor to the capital-intensive countries. So there's hardly any trade in net factor content. I find this a very useful perspective. The observed deviations from Hexaoline, you can read them as really asking, why isn't there in the global economy much more trade than what we observe? It's really a Coasian question about why are transactions costs so high and limiting what are potentially mutually beneficial exchanges. Another observed puzzle from the missing trade paper is this, namely that poor countries export less than is predicted by theory, and they import more than is predicted by theory. There's some difficulty in getting those countries to be viable sellers on a large scale, which our theory isn't quite picking up. So given all these problems, can we in fact save the Hexaolean theorem when it comes to empirics? And it turns out there actually is a way forward which makes the theory more defensible. Let's go back to the original Leontief critique. Leontief classified the United States as capital-intensive. But you might ask, well, who says the United States is in fact capital-intensive? You can add up the labor in the United States and you can add up the capital, but what's the natural unit of measurement? You might argue that if the United States has different technologies than other countries, which indeed it does, well, we need to sum up labor in the United States to take account of the quality of labor in the United States, because the quality of labor is augmented by how much capital we have invested. So once we allow for different technologies, and once we allow for the fact that labor may be more effective in some countries than others, well, there exist measures that make the U.S. labor-intensive rather than capital-intensive, and then the Leontief paradox would go away, because we would be measuring the U.S. as labor-intensive and finding that U.S. exports are also labor-intensive. To go back to our video on the theory of Hexa and Olen, keep in mind we really did assume a common technology across all countries. And when you have a common technology, it's relatively easy to add up which countries are labor-intensive or capital-intensive. But when that technology is varying, we then have to worry not just about the quantity of labor in a country, but how effective that labor is. There's even a way to make the Hexaolean theorem a kind of tautology. If you observe that the United States is exporting labor-intensive goods, simply postulate that we have technologies so that when you combine them with labor, the degree of quote-unquote effective labor in this country is so high that we're actually labor-intensive after all. And indeed, there's an interesting test of the Hexaolean theorem within a single country, looking only at regions of Japan, and of course within Japan, a relatively homogeneous country, you would expect technology across the different regions to be more or less constant. And what is it we find? Well, when technology is more or less uniform, the predictions of the Hexaolean theorem do pretty well, and in fact it's the capital-intensive regions of Japan which are exporting capital-intensive goods to other parts of Japan. Well, what to do? So there's now a whole new research program. What you can do is take observed Hexaolean theorem violations, then see, given those violations, what is the implied difference in technologies across borders, and then you can do independent tests to see if these differences are in fact true. The original postulated version of the Hexaolean theorem still is turning out to be false, but the theorem remains nonetheless useful. If you take the theorem and you modify the assumption of identical technologies, the combination of the theorem and an account of technological differences still will give you a kind of useful hammer for explaining some patterns of global trade. In this sense, the Hexaolean research paradigm is alive and well. This point about technology differences directs our attention to a fundamental link between the Hexaolean theorem and the lack of what is called factor-price equalization across borders. That is, returns to capital and returns to labor do not equalize across borders, do not equalize across rich and poor countries. This, too, in part, is because countries have different technologies or maybe even different cultures. In this regard, you can think of a culture as a technology. So there's this fundamental factor, some kind of differences across countries, which prevent perfect factor-price equalization, and they prevent the Hexaolean Theorem from holding, and we're back to this basic fundamental philosophical question that we have two literatures on international trade, Hexaolean Theorem and factor-price equalization, and they're both getting at what is basically the same question: how and why is it that countries are different, and how is it that those differences inhibit the amount of trade? The literature on the Hexaolean Theorem and related issues, of course, continues to grow. So some of the questions that people are working on now is trying to disaggregate the data better, so you're not just dealing with economy-wide or sector-wide measures of factor intensity, and also studying firm-level export decisions, again a move in the direction of greater disaggregation. The Hexaolean Theorem continues to generate fruitful puzzles for people to work on. This video already has listed plenty of sources and papers to read, but for overviews I found the following especially helpful. There's a paper by Heltman online called The Structure of Foreign Trade, and it provides an overview of some of these debates. The book by Robert Feenstra, Advanced International Trade, and the undergraduate text by Feenstra and Taylor give very good surveys on the Hexaolean Theorem. There's also a paper online by Davis and Weinstein called What Role for Empirics in International Trade? For closely related issues to Hexaolean, see also our videos covering the topics of increasing returns and international trade, the gravity equation, and also factor-price equalization. Let's now consider specific factors models of international trade. These models start with the basic point that not all factors of production are mobile. So for instance, imagine that you have a piece of land, you're growing grass on that land to feed to horses. Maybe you cannot easily take that same piece of land and build, say, an automobile factory geared for export on it. Another example of a partially immobile factor were auto workers in Detroit in the United States in the 1980s. As Japanese-made automobiles became more popular in the United States, many of these Detroit auto workers were worse off. Some of the more mobile ones may have moved to Texas and taken jobs in the energy sector, but the less mobile ones, the ones perhaps who were tied to the area because of their families, they now faced lower wages or perhaps lost their jobs altogether. A core lesson of the models is that the more mobile factors of production didn't suffer nearly as much. Let's say that you owned some corporate jets, and you used to rent out those corporate jets to executives of Ford or General Motors in Detroit. When the auto sector in Detroit contracted, yes, the demand for your jets went down, but there were many other things you could do with the jets, and basically you would fly your jets to some other part of the country and rent them out to some other set of executives, and the value of your jets, which are mobile, wouldn't go down very much at all. Now that was a case of rising imports, but let's say you have a sector where exports go up, and we then want to ask, who benefits from that? We will again turn to specific factors models. Just as the owners of the fixed or immobile factors can lose when things go badly, well, it's also the owners of the fixed factor who gain when things go very well. Pictured here is a place in France where grapes are grown, of course to be made into wine for export. If the demand for French wine goes up, well, which factors of production benefit? To the extent land is a fixed factor, there are only so many good lands for wine with the right climate and the right kind of grapes, well, then the French owners of those lands will be those who benefit. You might wonder, what about the French workers? Say the demand for grapes goes up because the demand for French wine has gone up. Well, are the French workers who pick the grapes going to be much better off? This again depends upon mobility. If there's mobility of other French workers into the grape-picking sector, any increase in wages will bring in more workers, and then the wage will go back down again. But if you imagine there's not much worker mobility into the grape-picking sector for whatever reason, then you will find that French workers, to some extent, will also be better off. As I'm making this video in 2013 in the United States in recent years, there has been a boom in the value of Indiana farmland. This is in part because the demand for soy has gone up, and the relatively immobile factor here is the land. Just to repeat the key lesson here, it's that changes in trade fall mainly upon the fixed factors of production. A secondary policy implication is that if a government wishes to protect its workers against, say, an increase in imports, what it can do is make labor markets more flexible and make it easier for those workers to be mobile into other regions or other occupations. For further reading, including some graphical presentations, what you can do is simply Google Specific Factors Model. We also recommend the textbook by Feenstra and Taylor and their chapter on this topic in their book, International Trade. Let's now consider the Hexaolean Theorem. This is basically a theorem about factor endowments. So how much capital or labor does a country have, and how do those factor endowments shape the content of trade? The simplest way to put the theorem is that countries which are relatively capital-intensive will export capital-intensive goods. Similarly, countries which are relatively labor-intensive will export labor-intensive goods. The intuition here really is pretty simple, and it's that factor endowments should matter. So imagine you had a country which quite easily grew lots of corn. What might you expect that country to export? Well, possibly corn. Now let's look at some of the underlying assumptions behind the theory. So in the core model, we have two countries, a home country and a foreign country. We assume two goods, computers and shoes. There are two factors of production, labor and capital, and we're going to assume here that it's the foreign country and shoe production which are labor abundant. We're also going to assume that factors can move across industries within a single country, but not across countries. That means if a country is rich in one factor, that factor is available for potential use in either sector. The theorem also will assume that final outputs are traded freely. A very important assumption is that of identical technologies in the two countries. That is, the available means of production are the same no matter where we are. The point here is not that this is descriptively realistic, but it's a way of focusing our attention on the differences in factor endowments alone. Please note this assumption because it will play a critical role in our video on empirical tests of the Hexaolean Theorem. Also, as simplifying assumptions, the theorem assumes that consumer tastes are identical across countries, and those tastes do not vary with the level of income. Again, those two assumptions both serve to help make factor endowments the key operating force at the margin. It's easiest to see a proof of the theorem in graphical terms, and here we're outlining the two production possibilities frontiers for the two countries. Here is the PPF for the home country, here is the PPF for the foreign country, and you'll find that, according to our assumptions, the PPF for the home country, it skews toward output of computers, because the home country has more capital, and the PPF of the foreign country, it skews toward the output of shoes, and thus it has this different slope, and that is related to the assumption that the foreign country has a lot of labor and can make shoes more readily. Let's now consider each country in the absence of international trade. So going again to the home country pictured here, what we see is we still have our PPF. We're now adding in a price vector which expresses the relative price of computers to shoes. And the way the slope of this price vector is drawn, it's suggesting that the home country has to give up a fair number of computers to get more shoes because it's harder for the home country to produce shoes. There are then also indifference curves expressing preferences for computers versus shoes, and we have a point of tangency given here by A, and that's where the home country ends up without trade. The situation of the foreign country is pictured here in this graph, and that's similar in principle, but you'll notice an important difference, in addition to having a different ppf, is that the price vector for the foreign country is different, and this again reflects the difference in factor of endowments. What's the case in the foreign country is that they have to give up a relatively high number of shoes to get more computers because it's basically hard for them to produce more computers. Now let's consider the picture for the home country after trade is possible. The key difference here is that now we have a new price line, and this new price line is given by the ability to trade for some shoes from the labor-intensive country. So we want to now ask, what is the point along the ppf that the home country will pick, knowing that it can then trade up along this price vector to get a different allocation of shoes and computers? Well, the way this is pictured, the home country gets on the highest indifference curve by producing at point B. Previously, without trade, they had been producing at point A, but now they will produce at B, which means producing more computers than before. They produce more computers, and they then trade up along this price line, and they achieve levels of consumption where for computers it's given down here, and for shoes it's given up here on the vertical axis. So here, if the home country is producing at point B, but consuming at point C, then we find the net exports of computers are given by this amount, that is the difference between B and C on the horizontal axis, representing computers, and the import of shoes is given by the difference between this point here and that point there, and here is the quantity of shoe imports, and we see exactly what the theorem had predicted, namely that the home country, the capital-intensive country, is exporting the capital-intensive good, namely computers. If we look at the foreign country, the labor-intensive country, it's the same logic but basically in reverse. The foreign country also faces a new price vector, and this will change how much they produce. They're looking to choose a place on their ppf where, after trading along the new price line, they can achieve a higher indifference curve or higher level of customer satisfaction. So without trade, they had been producing here at point A. Once trade is possible, they will produce here at point B. That means they will produce more shoes. They then move along this price vector, which represents trading those shoes for computers, and we find that shoe exports are given by this difference here, the difference between point B and point C drawn across to the horizontal axis, and computer imports are given by this difference here, again the difference between point B and point C drawn down to the horizontal axis, and again, as the Hexaolean Theorem suggests, here we have the labor-intensive country, and it is exporting the labor-intensive good, namely shoes. Admittedly, this is all under very simple assumptions, but the point is simply to isolate the effect of one mechanism, not to argue that it's the only thing going on in the real world. But what we have demonstrated is that under these simple assumptions, first, the capital-intensive country exports the capital-intensive product. Second, the labor-intensive country exports the labor-intensive product. That's the Hexaolean Theorem. For sources, we very much recommend the treatment in the Feenstra and Taylor text, International Trade, and indeed we have borrowed very directly from their PowerPoints. Also, if you don't have access to that book, you can just Google Hexaolean Theorem to some similar treatments. Let's now consider what are some of the broader economic and indeed even political and philosophical issues at stake when we examine competing theories of international trade. The relevant comparison here is between two views. On one side of the ledger are factor endowment theories, sometimes known as the Hexaolean Theorem, and they explain international trade by looking at what factor does a country have a lot of. On the other side of the ledger are hypotheses rooted in increasing returns to scale, and those stress the idea that after a country or region does something for a while, it gets to be very, very good at it. Both theories, of course, have some applicability, and we care about the relative weight of each theory simply as a matter of pure science. but we also care about it because it helps shape some of our broader views of the world. For instance, to the extent that we believe factor endowment approaches are relative, we will start to analyze the future prospects of countries by looking at, say, their capital and their labor endowments, and in general we will tend to believe that policy works through fundamentals. What's going to matter is what real resources can a country actually bring to the table. We might think a great deal about what is the savings rate in a particular country, or we might ask what can policy do to increase that savings rate. We'll be focused on the supply of labor, how much people work, how good are the incentives to work, and what will be the future demographics. Another factor endowment, of course, is natural resources, oil being one example of many, so we'll care a great deal about what real resources can we find in a country. Insofar as you believe in a factor endowments approach, probably you are more likely to believe there is a basic stability in the economic prospects of countries. You will tend to believe in mean reversion, that is, countries are able to make up from great catastrophes if they keep some of those fundamental resources intact, and in general you will believe in catch-up, that is, the abilities of countries with some resources to catch up to rivals by engaging in economic growth and investing that capital productively. To the extent you believe in increasing returns as a fundamental cause of trade, your view of the world is at least likely to be somewhat different. Rather than focusing so much on factor endowments and resources, you'll probably spend more time asking what is the source of those increasing returns, and very often this will point to knowledge. You'll likely be somewhat more interested in the economics of knowledge and also the economics of innovation and science. Given the possibility of increasing returns, you may believe a bit less in stability and catch-up and mean reversion, and you're likely to believe a bit more in the possibility of dramatic shifts and accelerations. Increasing returns theories will generally imply that small causes can indeed have very big effects, and that there exists the possibility of levers in human history. And in some cases, that initial advantage that gets you started down an increasing returns to scale path, that may well be the result of accident, luck, or contingency. The factor endowments view will suggest that these factors are much less important. An increasing returns to scale view is more likely to give you a focus on how policy can give economies or sectors or firms some kind of head start, rather than just thinking about how to augment factor supplies. These differences can indeed show up in matters of technical economics, but they also may well be influencing our worldviews more broadly when it comes to how do we understand human history and the likely future of economies. For more on all of this, I would recommend reading two of Paul Krugman's early books on international trade theory and different approaches to international trade. I would recommend our video on Paul Romer, and in general our collection of videos on the topics of increasing returns to scale and Hexaolean Theorem.
Okay, let's have a look at the Hexaolean approach. You can see here two pictures of Eli Hexa and Bertil Olen. So you can see here that we are now in the 20th century, and therefore you can expect that something will be more important to compared to the Ricardo world. And of course, it is the role of capital. So we are in the 20th century, and therefore capital has a much more important role compared to the Ricardo world. And we directly see this difference in the assumptions of the model. We are looking at two countries, Germany and China, two goods, steel and cloth,
And now we are looking at two factors of production, labor and capital. We assume that the steel sector is a capital-intensive sector, while the cloth sector is a labor-intensive sector. So when we are producing steel, we need a lot of capital, not too much labor. When we are producing cloth, we need a lot of labor, not too much capital. The production functions in the two countries are the same. So the technology within the two countries is the same. This is very interesting. So we assume that the two countries have the same stand of knowledge. So this is because of the fact that now information can flow between these two economies, and we just have to visit international libraries, and then we know the current stand of knowledge, so that production functions are the same in the two countries. This can also be justified, for example, when we think about foreign direct investment, FDI. Let's assume that VW, Volkswagen, that they have one plant in Germany and they also have one plant in China. Of course, the knowledge how to produce cars is within the company, and therefore we can produce cars in Germany and in China with the same production function. Technology is the same, the stand of knowledge is the same. What is the big difference between the countries? The big difference between Germany and China is that relative factor endowments are different. The domestic economy, Germany, is the capital-abundant country. It has a lot of capital, not too much labor. And the foreign country, China, is a labor-abundant country. It has a lot of labor and not too much capital. So the capital-labor ratio in Germany is larger than the capital-labor ratio in China. Germany is a capital-abundant country. Therefore, in the autarky scenario, it will be the case that the price of the capital-intensive good, steel, will be relatively low. China is a labor-abundant country, so the price of the labor-intensive good, cloth, will be relatively low in the autarky scenario. When it comes to international trade, then it will be the case that Germany will specialize in steel and will export steel because of the fact that steel is relatively cheap in Germany. And China will specialize in cloth and will export cloth because cloth is relatively cheap in China. This kind of pattern of international trade is condensed in the so-called Hexaolean Theory. A country will export the commodity that uses relatively intensively its relatively abundant factor of production, and it will import the good that uses relative intensively its relatively scarce factor of production. What does this Hexaolean theorem implies for our example? Germany is the country which is capital abundant, and steel is using capital relative intensively. So Germany will export the commodity that uses relative intensively its relatively abundant factor of production. So Germany will export steel. And will import the good that uses relative intensively its relatively scarce factor of production. Scarce factor of production in Germany is labor. The good which uses relatively intensively this scarce factor of production, this is cloth. So Germany will import cloth. So in the first step, we examined what are the consequences of these differences in relatively factor endowment for the pattern of international trade. Hence, we know which country is specializing in which sector and which country is exporting which good, which country is importing the other good. But this pattern of international trade has an impact on the two factor prices. So there will be some consequences for the interest rate, the price of capital, and there will also be some consequences for the wage rate, the price of labor. Let's have a deeper look into these factor markets and check how this pattern of international trade affect the factor markets. In Germany, it is the case that the steel sector expands and the cloth sector shrinks. So some resources, like capital and labor, are shifted from the cloth sector to the steel sector. The cloth sector is shrinking, the steel sector is expanding. But the bundle of resources which is released from the cloth sector is different from the bundle which is desired in the steel sector, because the factor intensities in the two sectors are different. The cloth sector is releasing a bundle of factors of production which contain a lot of labor and not too much capital units. So the cloth sector is releasing a lot of labor units but not too much capital. But the steel sector, which is expanding, needs a lot of capital but not too much labor. So we have a mismatch on the two factor markets so that factor prices will be affected. We have a higher demand for capital and we have a lower demand for labor. The consequences for the wage rate and the interest rates are highlighted on the next slide. You can see here in the left part the capital market, the price, the interest rate for capital on the left vertical axis, on the horizontal axis the number of capital units. On the labor market we have on the vertical axis the wage rate and on the horizontal axis the labor units traded. There is a downward sloping demand curve and we assume that supply is given. Now we said, due to the fact that the cloth sector shrinks and does not release too much capital, and the steel sector expands and needs a lot of capital, we have an increase for capital. So the demand curve in the German capital markets will shift to the right, and therefore the interest rate increases. On the German labor market, it is the other way around. The cloth sector is releasing a lot of labor, but the expanding steel sector doesn't need this number of labor units, so we have a mismatch on the labor market. The demand for labor decreases, so that the demand curve shifts to the left. The demand curve shifts to the left, and the wage rate decreases. As you can see here in this graph, the two factor markets are affected in a different way. Demand for capital increases and the interest rate increases, while on the labor market it is the case that demand for labor decreases and the wage rate decreases. These kind of movements of the two factor prices are condensed in the so-called Stolper-Samuelson theorem. the increase in the price of the abundant factor in Germany, the interest rate increases, and the fall in the price of the scarce factor, the wage rate decreases, imply that the owners of the abundant factor, capital, will find their real incomes rising, and the owners of the scarce factor, labor, will find their real incomes falling. So the owners of the relatively abundant factor, they are in favor of international trade. They are free traders. The owners of the relatively scarce factor, they are in favor of trade restrictions. So in Germany, it would imply that labor unions are more against international trade because of the fact that international trade would lead to a decrease in the wage rate. They would favor trade restrictions. Okay, when it comes to the Hexaolean Theory, it is a case that it seems to be the case that we have some winners and some losers of the globalization process. Those households who own capital, they benefit from international trade because the interest rate increases. They get more compensated for these capital units. And the households which can only provide labor at the labor market, they observe that the wage rate is decreasing so that their income decreases. So now it really depends how capital and labor is distributed within our society. In case that we assume that we have a representative agent in our economy, that all the households in our economy are the same, so that each household has some income from the capital market because each household owns some stocks and bonds and receives income in form of dividend and interest, then everything is fine. Like all the households profit from the increase in the interest rate, and all households suffer a little bit from the decrease in the wage rate. When we really look into detail, it would be the case that we are able to prove that a representative agent will win from the globalization process, that the increase in the interest rate overcompensates for the loss on the wage rate. But when we abolish the assumption of the representative agent, then of course it might be the case that one group of society is winning while another group of the society is losing. In case that we have some households which have no capital at all, and those households can only provide labor at the labor market, they will be against international trade because of the fact that they only receive wage income, and wages are decreasing from this globalization process. So it really depends on how capital and labor are distributed within our society. It might be the case that we have a group which is losing from the globalization process. This is the main insight, I think, from the Hexaolean model. It might be the case that some groups within one society will lose from international trade.
Study Hexaolean Theory of Trade. So here is what we are going to study in this lecture. We will start with the production possibility frontier, and we will compare this production possibility frontier with the one that we studied earlier in a single factor of production, that was the labor in David Ricardo's model. Then next we will see the relationship among output prices and the input prices, or what we call the prices of the factors of production, the wages and the rents, and the level of inputs. Again, the relationship among the output prices, the input prices, and the level of inputs, the amount of factors of production that we are going to use, and we will see how much we can produce with those levels of input. Then we will see how can we trade in this type of model, the trade that is explained by the Hexaolean Theory. And finally, we are going to see the impact of such type of production on the income distribution. Does this theory explain the variation in income distribution within a country? Some people may benefit more as compared to the other group. So we will study that in our lecture. Hexaolean model basically follows the theory of labor productivity, or also known as the theory of comparative advantage. Comparative advantage theory tells us that countries trade because they have comparative advantage in certain goods. And that advantage occurs because of the difference in labor productivity. Means that in some countries, labor are productive in producing cheese, whereas in other countries, labor are productive in the wine sector. So, because of their difference in labor productivity, they are able to produce abundantly certain goods and then trade with each other. Hexaolean theory basically does not reject the comparative advantage theory, rather aids to it. What Hexaolean theory believes in is that it is not only the labor productivity that matters, but resource differences matters. In each country we have different resources, and that enables a country to trade. For example, if we look at Saudi Arabia, they are not rich in agricultural lands. They have a limited cultivatable land, but they have abundant oil resources. So, Saudi Arabia will trade in petroleum products. And this is not because their labor is efficient in oil producing, but rather than they have abundant oil resources. Similarly, if you look at Pakistan, we cannot produce oil at that competitive level because we do not have sufficient oil resources, and comparatively we have abundant agriculture lands available to us. Therefore, we produce agricultural goods, and Saudi Arabia will produce petroleum goods, and both these countries will trade with each other. So basically, Hexaolean theory argues that not only the difference in labor, but the labor skills, the physical capital, the land, or other factors of production across countries create this productive difference. Countries have relative abundance of factors of production. Some countries are abundant in land, whereas other countries are abundant in labor, and some countries might be abundant in capital. So, all countries have different level of abundance in different factors. And again, production processes use factors of production with relative intensity. It means relative intensity basically means that in some countries, labor will be used more as compared to capital, whereas in certain countries we will be using capital more as compared to labor. It depends entirely on the abundance of these resources. So when we want to discuss the Hexaolean model, there are a set of assumptions that need to be understood first, and these assumptions are that we have two factors of production for the model. One we call the labor, and the second factor of production, that is land. We are ignoring all other factors of production such as capital and entrepreneurship. Then the second assumption is that the amount of labor services and the land varies across countries. Means labor and land will be in different quantities in different countries. They cannot be the same. There will be more labor in one country and more land in another country. Then the third assumption is that the quantity of land and labor will remain fixed in those countries. The total labor available in Pakistan will not change, and similarly the total amount of land in Pakistan will not change. It will remain constant. Similarly, it will not change in the other country that we are studying. This amount will be fixed. And remember that this is only an assumption. We may relax this assumption in order to understand the impact of these factors of production. What if we increase the factor of production in a country? What will happen? So for that purpose, we can relax this assumption, but the model overall assumes that this factor of production will remain constant. Then again, two goods will be produced, and we name those goods as clothes and food. No other goods will be produced in this economy. How will the price be determined in this economy? Basically, the prices are determined through competition, and whenever we use competition, we means supply and demand. So how will wages be determined? Wages in an economy will be determined through supply of labor and demand of labor. When at whichever point they are in equilibrium, that will determine the amount of labor utilized in that economy and the wages that will be given to them. Similarly, it is true for land. The rent of the land is also determined through competition, through the supply and demand forces. And our final assumption for this model is that only two countries are model, and we name those two countries. We call one domestic country and the other we call foreign country. So basically, if you look at these assumptions, what you see that we have two factors of production, and then only two goods are produced, and only two countries are modeled. So this model, the Hexaolean model, is also called cross-two model. The production possibility frontier in our previous model was a straight line. For example, we had two goods. One we call clothes and the other we call food. PPF was a straight line sloping downward, but now the production possibility frontier will not be a straight line, rather than it will be a curved one. It will be curving towards the outside. So what is the basic reason for that? It is because previously we were using a single factor of production, but whenever we are using two factors of production, then marginal productivity of labor and marginal productivity of land both will come into work. The more you utilize land, the more the quantity of food will decline with the passage of time. Anyhow, we are going to discuss it in the coming scenarios. So let us first define some of the variables that we are going to use here. The first one is ATC. ATC is basically the hectares of land. T represents land, or alternately we call that terrain, whereas C represent its usage for the production of cloth. Similarly, the ALC represents labor used for the production of cloth. Labor hours used for the production of producing 1 meter square of cloth. Again, we define ATF as hectares of land used for production of 1 calorie of food, and ALF as hours of labor used to produce 1 calorie of food. L is the total amount of labor available for the production, and T is the total amount of land or terrain available for production. Remember that we have discussed in our assumption that the amount of L and the amount of T in the economy will remain fixed. It is important to note that for the production possibility frontier, both the factors of production are required. We will be using land as well as labor in order to produce the amount of cloth required and the amount of food that we require. So the basic equation for the total allocation of land resources is given as ATF into QTF plus ATC into QTC, which should equal to T. And it will be less than T in case we are not utilizing the entire land for the production of these two goods. But if we are using the entire land resources, then it will equal to T. Basically, ATF shows the amount of resources, the land resources for the production of food, and ATC into QC shows the amount of total land used for the production of cloth. Combining these two gives us the total amount of land that has been utilized. We can do the same math for the labor. Total labor utilized for production of food and total labor used for production of cloth. And this gives us the total labor utilized in our production. Now, we need an important assumption regarding the production possibility frontier. Since we have two goods, one is called cloth and the other one is called food. Now, the nature of these two goods is different. We consider cloth to be labor-intensive good, meaning that when we want to produce a unit of cloth, we need more labor as compared to land for its production. And for food, we need more land rather than more labor for its production. So we say that cloth is labor intensive and food is land intensive. The equation we can use for this purpose is ALC or ATC, which is greater than ALF or ATF. Let me rewrite this equation so that we can understand the statement more clearly. You know that ALC is the amount of labor required for the production of cloth, and we compare it to the amount of land required for the production of cloth. So this amount overall is greater than the amount of labor required for the production of food as compared to the amount of land required to the production of food. The equation simply means that labor requirement for cloth is more as compared to labor requirement for food. The assumption influences the slope of production possibility frontier. Now, when we want to produce cloth or we want to produce food, we can substitute the amount of labor for the production of cloth with certain amount of land. But let's assume that we are not able to substitute these two factors of production. If that is true, then we will get two independent production possibility frontiers, such as you see in the graph. The one is for labor and the second one is for land. How much we can produce depends on the slope of these individual constraints. Now the green area shows us our production possibility frontier. This is what we can produce. The red area also is producible, but that production is inefficient. So in such scenario, what we get a kinked production possibility frontier, and this kink is usually inwards. The production possibility frontier is different when the factors of production are substitutable. In this case, we get a curved production possibility frontier. Now, why is it a bow shape? The basic reason for that is that now we have two factors of production, and when keeping one factor of production and increasing the other factor, we have a decreasing marginal productivity. For example, we have factor of production of land, and we have the total output of food QF. Now, when we increase the amount of labor while keeping the amount of land constant, what happens? Our productivity increases, but as we increase more and more labor, our marginal productivity is declining. This marginal productivity, this decline in the marginal productivity of labor causes the kink shape. As we have discussed, we can use multiple combinations of input, that is the land and labor, to produce a single unit of food. But remember that this combination is not constant. For example, we may sacrifice 1 unit of land, and we may substitute that with half unit of labor initially. You see, we may substitute that with half unit of labor. But the more and more we substitute it with labor, we may ultimately need to change 1 unit of land with 3 units of labor. So the point is, in the production of each unit of food, unit factor requirement of land and labor are not constant. And you see, it is apparent from the graph that the slope is not constant. It is not a straight line. Isocont is not a straight line, but its slope varies as we try to use different combinations of land and labor. Now, the production possibility frontier tells us what we can produce, but it does not tell us the worth of that production. Let me draw the production possibility frontier here. For example, we have food on the y-axis and cloth on the x-axis, and we have a production possibility frontier. We can produce anything within this red line. Let me mark that with blue. We can produce anything in this area. We cannot produce anything over here. On the red area, we cannot produce anything. But if we want to produce efficiently, we'll be producing over the production possibility frontier. And we can have multiple points on the production possibility frontier. For example, this is point A, point B, and point C. All of these can be produced, but what is the worth of these points, what is the worth of these combinations of code? They will not remain the same. So we need to understand them. The production possibility describes the economy can produce, but to determine what the economy does produce, we must know the prices of these goods. In general, the economy should produce at the point that maximizes the value of production. If the value of production is maximum at point A, we will produce at point A. If it is maximum at point C, we will produce at point C. Otherwise, if it is maximum at B, we can produce at point B. How we know the value of production? It is given by the equation V is equal to PC into QC plus PF into QF. The overall value of production depends on the prices of cloth and the prices of food. The overall value of cloth is PC into QC. Price of cloth multiplied by the amount of cloth that we have produced, and then PF into QF tells us the overall value of the food that we have produced. Combining these two gives us the overall value of our production. So basically, it depends on the values of the PC and PF. PC represents here the price of cloth, PF represents here the price. Using the same equation, we can derive the ISO value line. What is an ISO value line? It represents a constant value for a specific production. So let us go back to the main equation that we have discussed now. V is equal to PC into QC plus PF into QF. Keeping its value constant, we may write it in terms of quantity of cloth or quantity of food. So taking food to the left-hand side and keeping the rest of the equation on the right-hand side, taking V to the right-hand side, we have our new equation as PF into QF equals V minus PC into QC. And again, dividing both sides by PF, we get QF and V over PF minus PC by PF QC. So this is a straight line. We get a straight line for ISO value, where value remains constant, and minus PC by PF, it is actually the slope of this line. Whereas V by PF, this is actually the intercept. V by PF will be the intercept of our ISO value line. Let us integrate this ISO value line into our production possibility frontier. Our first ISO value line, let us call that V1. This is possible. We can produce anything on V1, but this will be an inefficient production because it falls below the production possibility frontier. Let's say if we produce at point A, we are not utilizing our entire resources. Again, at point B, we are using more resources than before, but again, this is not efficient. At point C, our production possibility frontier is at its maximum. But what is wrong with point C? We are not producing the quantity that gives us the maximum value. But if you look at point Q, we have maximum value as well as an efficient production. Again, anything above that, let us say that we want to produce at point, we call it F. At point F, we are unable to produce. The value is more as compared to point Q, but that is beyond our production capacity. We do not have enough resources to produce at point F. What we can summarize from this discussion is that given the prices of output, a point on one iso-value line represents the maximum value of production, say at point Q. At that point, the slope of the PPF equals the slope of the iso-value line, and the slope of iso-value line is given by minus PC or PF, and this is also our opportunity cost. Our opportunity cost must equal to the relative price of clothes as compared to the relative price of food. In other words, the trade-off in production equals to the trade-off according to the two important key points that we have studied up to this point is that country will produce on its production possibility frontier because that is efficient production, and they will produce equal to the relative prices of the two goods, that is on the iso-value line. And the third important decision is, in order to produce that amount, how much of the factors of production are required. So they depend on the price of factors of production, and price of factors of production basically are the wage given to the labor and the rent given to the landowners. So again, it depends on the market prices of the factors of production. If wage rates are high and lending rates are low, land rates are low, then firms will use more land as compared to labor. So this is enough for today's lecture. In the next lecture, we will continue with the remaining of the Hexaolean model.